Hi, everyone, and welcome to the course of world history. I am your host, Mr. Samuelson, and today we're looking at the American Revolution. Our essential question is, how did the government created through this American Revolution differ from the strong governments that we've seen in absolutist systems? We're looking at that difference. So let's look a little back in time at the roots of America itself, coming from England, Britain, United Kingdom. Well, which one are we going to say? Well, 1707, England and Scotland united to form this single kingdom. Okay, this is an important part in English, British history. This was called at that time the United Kingdom of Great Britain, and we're going to call it Great Britain for a good long time now. And this is really where that title comes from. Now, this term does refer to the United English and Scots. It will grow beyond that, but we're not going to deal with that today. Now, in 1714, just a few years after this, a new dynasty comes to take over the United Kingdom. This is the Hanoverian dynasty. The Queen of England had died without any heirs, so they brought over a related members of their extended family to take over the British throne. But the Hanoverians are German. They're unfamiliar with the British parliamentary system. The first Hanoverian king doesn't even speak English. And so they really leave the government of their country to Parliament itself. And Parliament is able to use kind of the semi-disinterest of George I and George II, the first two Hanoverian kings, to acquire tremendous power. And Parliament really comes to be in charge of Great Britain. They were already kind of well on their way before this. English Civil War, we're not going to get into that. But Parliament is large and in charge. And as a large and in charge Parliament, particularly under the leadership of William Pitt, a very effective prime minister, the British Empire begins to really expand. In 1757, the British enter into a global conflict. Some might even call it a world war, although it's kind of a Eurocentric way to look at it. But it did go well beyond Europe. This conflict is called the 7 Years' War. Now, here in the United States, sometimes we give this a different name. We call it the French and Indian War. But the French and Indian War was a small part of a much larger global conflict called the 7 Years' War. Now, this war was a tremendous success for the British. And after this, they are kind of the undisputed great power of the world. They've been kind of back and forth with the French for a little while, but this is where the British Empire really comes into its own. They are the premier power in the world. And at the end of this war, 1764, they control the original 13 colonies. They've pushed out to the Mississippi River. They've taken Canada. They've taken chunks of India. They've got all these islands throughout the Caribbean. They're doing quite well for themselves. Now, the 7 Years' War had been very expensive. The British had spent a lot of money to fight and win this war. So to pay off those debts, they then raised taxes on their colonies. Now, the 13 original American colonies, they took issue with this because one of the principles of British government was the idea of no taxation without representation. The American colonies didn't have representation in Parliament, and it was Parliament imposing these taxes on the American people. American people were not okay with being taxed, but not having representation. And so a series of protests began. Those protests became violent. The violent protests led to British armies coming down to suppress those protests, which led to more violence, and eventually it boils over into the United States declaring independence from Great Britain, largely over this issue of taxation and representation. Now, this American Revolutionary War was led by this handsome fella on this even more handsome horse, George Washington. Now, his kind of plan after the initial stages of the war, his plan to win is largely to fight a war of attrition. That is, win by not losing. His strategy here was that over time, the British Empire, which was already stretched financially from the debts of the 7 Years' War, would have trouble fighting a prolonged war. So this strategy really does draw out the length of this war, makes it a long war, and it makes it an expensive war for the British. And once this starts to pay dividends, especially when the Americans start to win some battles, they, again, didn't win very many major ones early on, but Saratoga in upstate New York wound up being a big one. It kind of convinced the Europeans that this revolution, this revolt was real. And after that, they were kind of eager to put Great Britain in their place, especially the French. The French were upset that they had lost a series of wars and territories to the British, and so they joined the American forces. Together, the French and the Americans worked together to defeat the British at the Battle of Yorktown, which really seals the American independence. After that battle, a free, independent United States is assured. So we have a new nation. Yay! Now we got to govern. That's hard. Because Americans had founded this nation on the principle that we should take care of ourselves, that we don't need a strong government to dictate. They might do things that we don't like tax us. So we wanted a really, really weak government, and that's what we got. And we learned that it didn't work. Our first government, the Confederated Congress, created under our first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, was weak. It couldn't solve hardly any of our problems. There are a couple things they did okay with, but most of the time they just failed. So in 1787, the states were like, we need a better government. Let's meet and talk about that. And so they had a constitutional convention and they created a stronger government, a big, strong, muscular government. But again, we're worried about this. We don't want a strong government. So we need to confine our stronger government. We need safeguards to make sure that it can't become too powerful. And so the Constitution puts in place a number of these safeguards. The best known is probably the separation of powers, the idea that we created 3 branches of government. Those 3 branches of government also have checks on the powers of the other ones to keep any branch from becoming too powerful. It then further divided the power of government between state governments and a central government, creating that tension between the two on purpose to weaken both of them. Now, this winds up being a dramatic shift away from what we've seen in Europe through the 1700s, which is increasing shifts toward absolutism and the absolute authority of the monarch. The United States wanted to go in the polar opposite direction. One last thing that they put in place to limit the power of that government was a Bill of Rights, because after the Constitution was done and they had this powerful government that was confined and weakened by itself, they were still wondering, you know what, if the 3 branches of government were to unite together and all be in agreement on something, they could do almost anything that they wanted. We need to put in more limits on their power. And so they created a Bill of Rights, amendments that went directly into the Constitution that even if the branches of government were aligned and agreed, they still couldn't break these rights. They still couldn't do these things. It gave the people more protection from their government. The people appreciated this. We've only amended our Constitution a total of 27 times, 10 of them coming almost right away. So not too many amendments since then. This has been a document that has functioned fairly well for the United States, not without flaws, but fairly well since 1789. I hope you enjoyed this one. I hope you learned a thing or two. I'll see you next time. Farewell.